Hey guys, welcome to week 7. Now we are going to be incorporating some posterior chain activity. What I mean by posterior chain, we're really going to be emphasizing the activation of the hamstrings coupled with the gluteus maximus. Now it's going to be essential that we wire in some intrinsic variables, specifically in that region. We're going to have to kind of stretch some tissues in order to enable you to get a better functioning activation of your glute max and hamstring. So we're going to be incorporating a form of a stretch. I'm not a big proponent of stretching, but the way that we're going to do it should be a little more functional. After that, we're going to then move on into what we'd call a wall press with your legs. It's going to begin to stimulate the gluteus maximus at the initiation of our extension of the hips, and then we're going to then move on into a heel drag, which will be another initiation of the step with the hips. Later on down the road, next week, we'll be covering in terms of how to activate muscles on the extension phase. So to briefly explain what we're going to be focusing on right now, there's a point in which the glute max needs to begin its function. So we know that hip extension starts from a hip flexion. Okay, so before my leg can kick back like this, or in this regard, we need to put tension on the hamstrings to pull it back in this direction. A big problem with most people is that when they walk, anytime they are taking a step, since they are constantly in this wired hip hyperextension, or they're constantly moving through a lateral shift, lateral tilt of the pelvis and rib cage, since they're constantly performing these types of movements while they walk, they tend to lose the tension on that upper hamstring, gluteus maximus region, to propel themselves straight forward. So to go through a brief explanation, you want your legs moving straight forward and back like this. So as you guys see me moving, they're pulling me forward. This is called a horizontal force vector, okay? That means that, so if you start thinking about a vertical force vector, we're thinking about Olympic lifts, barbell squats, we're thinking about something moving vertically, longitudinally. You guys have heard me talk about that. I'm looking at a horizontal force vector, right? We're looking at, I guess you would call it a latitudinal force vector. It's going this way to this way. When we start looking at how the body actually stabilizes itself through movement, a big part of it's going to be your standing neutral position, right? TBA, diaphragm, that will be a big part of it. But really, that's just there to enable us to get better horizontal movements. If you guys see my arms, in what direction are they swinging? They're swinging primarily in a horizontal plane. If you guys look at my legs, they're swinging primarily in a horizontal plane. If I'm missing that, this is what I'm going to do. Boom, boom, boom. This is typically what people mostly walk like. You'll see this instability in the hips or overstability in the hips, and that relates to a whole heap of problems that are going to create a mess of issues later on down the road. You'll end up having a whole group of problems in terms of with the hip pains and the knee pains. This is where most of that stuff tends to stem from. So what we're going to focus on right now is the preparation of horizontal force vector training with the glute max. And we're going to emphasize the glute max before anything because it probably is the most important muscle in regards to your dynamic movement. TBA is the most important probably in regard to stability. That's what we've primarily been focusing on prior to the 5th week and prior. Now we're going to start getting into, okay, how do we activate the glutes in conjunction with the TBA? You guys have already learned how to activate your thoracic spine and your TBA. So you should already understand what it feels like to activate your core, what that tension is supposed to feel like when you're in a standing neutral position. You should also begin to feel what it's like to activate your thoracic spine when you're in that standing neutral position. All we're going to do is just apply this into to another context. Keep in mind, your spine may not always be straight. I want you guys to understand that this is not how you move with everyday life. There's going to be certain functions where you do need to do that, but all your standing neutral position and all these tensions really represent is a foundation for your brain to work off of. It's just bringing you to this. Your standing neutral position is just the center of the spectrum. So we have kyphosis over here, right? Or let's say a spine flexion that's over here. Then we have a spine hyperextension that's over here. All the standing neutral position represents is the centering principle. And you just work your tissues relative to that principle until you finally get a very, very strong body in which a muscle will either flex or extend or hyperextend. If this is extension, it would hyperextend to a very, very high capacity. Right now, what we are going to work on is the tension created from that flexion or that hyperextension, or from flexion moving all the way into that extension. I think it's supposed to be the other way. Going from flexion all the way to hyperextension, we're going to create that beginning push to move the tissues and hopefully get you more to a balanced position. Now, if you're walking, more than likely you're going to be doing this kind of stuff. When you sprint, there will be this curvature of that lumbar spine. We need to learn how to rewire that. We'll talk about the cueing of that later in the last week of this program, because it's fundamental to understand how you guys need to adjust and just in general modify the gait dysfunctions that are going on with your body. So without further ado, what we're going to go into right now is a hamstring stretch. We're going to start to stretch the posterior chain right now, and I'm going to have Kathy standing and giving you a lateral view. Now, why are we going to want to stretch the posterior chain, especially right here proximal to that gluteal fold? Simply because it tends to hold you in an anterior pelvic shift. When you move into dynamic settings, typically, I mean, from almost 99 to 100% of all people that I've ever put through a transverse twist react to the end of the transverse twist by shifting their pelvis forward and kyphotically flexing. It's almost everyone I've ever trained that does that in that given context. So therefore, what does that mean? The hamstring muscles, the gluteal muscles are pulling, primarily the glute max is pulling the pelvis into an anterior pelvic shift. So this is flexion here, this is extension, this is hyperextension. So an anterior shift, again, is just the posterior chain drifting the pelvis forward. So what we're going to focus on right now is a stretch of these tissues to enable the pelvis to drop back into a little bit more of a posterior shift, and that's going to enable us to begin to fire the glute max on this extension phase, or from the flexion to extension phase, instead of only working from the extension to hyperextension phase. Just think, if this is pulling you from the front, you got power. If this is pulling you from here to here, you only have lateral shifts. You're only going to get that kind of stuff. Not good. We want to have capability of getting that drive on that through that glute max, and we have to build that first association of eliminating that anterior pelvic shift so we can retension that gluteus maximus. So to be very simply put, this is a very, very basic stretch, but there's a few simple cues that I want you guys to look for. So for one, I'm going to have Kathy actually soften her knee. She's going to give me a little bit of knee flexion to start. Give me a little more knee flexion. Now as she does that, she's going to do two things. The pelvis is going to go that way, the shoulders are going to go that way. Okay, so she's going to start shifting her pelvis in this direction. So she's going to physically move her butt back, and she's going to suspend herself right here on these hamstring muscles. So I want this to come back a little bit further, Kathy. Right about there's right. Going to keep the scapula back here. Good. Going to bend the knees a little bit from there. Okay, so as she came down, I want you guys to notice what she did with her pelvis. Give me a posterior tilt, Kathy. All the way, all the way. We're going to create a kyphosis in the lumbar. There we go. We don't want her coming down with this bent spine here. This could mean one of two things if you're a person who tends to bend down here. You've probably gone down too far, or your hip flexors don't have enough strength to pull the pelvis back into an anterior tilt. Your psoas, your rectus femoris are going to pull your pelvis into an anterior tilt. If you find yourself getting in this, you need to bring your chest a little bit higher. Now you guys will see that she's back at neutral. At that point, this is when you're going to institute the cues that I'll be explaining here in a second. So watch for this first. The spine is going to stay straight. So go to standing, Kathy. Now start dropping into that hamstring stretch. So as she starts dropping into that hamstring stretch, she's going to slowly anteriorly tilt the pelvis to maintain this neutral position of the spine. Drop the chest down a little lower. So now she should already begin to feel a stretch in the hammies. Yes or no? Okay. So now she's neutral. She's already feeling the tug in the hamstrings. Now I want you guys to really consider this. She's going to flex her knees, bend the knees a little bit, hold that. She's going to lose a little bit of the stretch there. And now I'm going to have her drop her chest a little further. Stop there till she feels a stretch with a knee flexion. Okay. If I activate the hamstring muscles on knee flexion, the only thing, if the tissues are active proximal to the knee joint here, the only thing that's going to get the stretch will be the fibers up here closer to the glute max. So now as she drops her chest down, if this is active, we won't be able to feel as much of a stretch here. So we're going to localize that stretch going up here. Now as I tell her to slowly extend her knees, this is when you'll begin to get a little bit more of that stretch mechanism going on. Okay, now I want her to also shift her pelvis in that direction. Shift her pelvis back, Kathy. So as she shifts her pelvis in that direction, she's going to get an even deeper stretch out of those hamstrings. Do you feel that there? So just think about leaning back. It's not just about anteriorly tilting. You have to shift your pelvis back. Go ahead and stand up. And as you stand up, as she stands up, you'll notice you'll see that beautiful hinge that comes out of that. So people who do the deadlifts and whatnot, who obsess over that kind of stuff, this is something that's really, really important. Why did that hinge happen so nicely? Because we elastically stretched the glute max in a functional capacity that then created what? a contraction mechanism that wound up bringing it back to neutral very easily. Okay, so this is again going to help us address that anterior pelvic shift. It's going to help us address those dependencies on the hyperextension phase of our glute max usage, and it's going to start building us from that flexion to extension in a way that you would be using in your functional movement. So let's go right back down, Kathy. She's going to soften the knees first. She's going to shift her pelvis that way and anteriorly tilt the pelvis at the same time. Okay. Like we were doing in that quad pad before with the TVA activation and an anterior pelvic tilt, I want you guys, these are going to be the cues I need you to look at. There's 3 cues: posterior pelvic shift, anterior pelvic tilt, abdominal compression. The retraction of the abdomen, anterior pelvic tilt, posterior pelvic shift. Those are all going to happen at the same time. Then she's going to slowly drop her chest down and extend the knees. Hold that. Multiple things are going on at the same time right now. So it's not just one thing and then the other. It's multiple things that we're attacking here. Do you feel that stretch? Go ahead and slowly stand up. You'll see that nice hinge begin to happen. You're keeping most of the pressure on your heels. The pressure stays on the heels while you're doing this stretch. Do not get your pressure on your toes. That's going to take a substantial amount of the tension away and keep it locked into the plantar fascia. The plantar fascia, odds are, is probably going to be fairly tight on most of you guys. It's going to be probably in a dysfunctional state. So we need to make sure that plantar fascia is getting that nice tug on it as well. Let's go again, Kathy. So again, we're bending the knees. Abdominals are in. She's going to anteriorly tilt, retract her abdomen, and then posteriorly shift her pelvis at the same time. Okay? Now, once you start getting this really, really dialed in, and you're noticing that you're able to maintain your spinal position, of course, if you're looking in the mirror and checking yourself, what you're going to then do is hold that TVA anterior tilt, posterior pelvic shift, and then you're going to slowly begin to institute a slight bit of knee extension. Keep going. Keep going, and now you're going to begin to notice those shakes begin to happen, because now we're really pushing the spectrum. If you want to zoom in on this, then you can kind of begin to see it. Extend the knees a little bit. There we go. Keep going, keep going, keep going. This is when we begin to get those shakes. You'll begin to see the muscles beginning to vibrate. This is a nervous system, the vastus lateralis, saying, oh, we can't take this anymore. Oh, I don't know if I want to do this, crap. But this is where the real change begins to be facilitated. This is when you employ that knee extension from that hip flex position. Your goal should be to be able to extend the knees all the way out. Keep extending while you're maintaining that neutral spine. Take a break. Go ahead and stand up. Very, very intense stuff if you can do it correctly. So again, the 3 main cues are going to be that retraction of the abdomen, the anterior pelvic tilt, and then from there, the posterior pelvic shift. So the pelvis move is going to drift that in that direction. Okay, the pressure is going to be on the heels. Keep the pressure on the heels, and you're just going to drop your chest gradually. The spine stays flat through the entire range of motion. Okay, that's what we're going to be working on for right now. Let's do one more repetition of that, Kathy. Knees are bent, posterior pelvic shift, and then anterior pelvic tilt. All at the same time. She's going to drop her chest. Spine is remaining, keeping that flat position. Good, hold that position there. She's going to then slowly begin to extend her knees to push the spectrums of what's going on. Okay, if you were to look on the front side, also watch that your knees are not caving into a valgus or a varus. Really watch that the knees are in somewhat of a neutral point too. We want neutrality here. Internally rotate your knees, Kathy. So if you feel that your knees are caving in, then externally rotate the knees so you get them into the proper position. Rotate them out. There we go. So now she's in a more neutral point there. Okay, we want to watch out for a lot of asymmetries here. This is some kind of stuff that's a little bit harder to check simply because you don't really have mirrors or anything positioned to check your spinal alignment. So in that regard, you may have to find somebody to show that there's not a shift of the pelvis going one way or the rib cage. If you just hold your TVA together, that should stop most of those asymmetries. Go ahead and stand up, Kathy. Okay, so right there, we just got those hamstrings to get a really, really good stretch proximal to the glute max. We've prepared the fibers proximal to the glute max, so now we're going to take this over to the wall. Okay, so I'm going to have Kathy laying on her back with her feet on the wall. Okay, go ahead and step away from the wall a little bit further. So you're going to get about almost a foot distance from the wall, then bring your feet down till your shin bones are till your toes are just underneath your knee joint. Now what I'm doing is I'm going to take your glute max and your hamstrings, and I'm going to take them through a very deep range of motion, a deep lengthening. And then what we're going to employ while we're in this deep lengthened position is an activation of the tissues. And this is a very, very simple thing to do. All you're going to do is this. She's going to lift her pelvis off the ground. Okay? Go ahead and bring your elbows up, Kathy, so they can kind of see your pelvis. She's going to bring her hips off the ground and then just drive her heels away from the wall, just enough to the point where she's not going to move. This would probably be best done on some kind of a rubber flooring or a carpet because you need friction to keep you where you're at. But with that said, this should still be able to work out for us, okay? All she's going to do is while she's holding her TVA the same way, she's going to slightly posteriorly shift the pelvis from that little lift that she was at, and then she's going to anteriorly tilt the pelvis the same way that we were just doing that hamstring stretch a minute ago. So anteriorly tilt the pelvis, good. Rotate the knees in a little bit, push under the wall a little. You feel the hamstrings working? And right now you'll begin to feel some activation right here out of that entire posterior chain. So we're training a deep, deep, deep contextual activation. We're pushing it way across that spectrum, or this spectrum over here, into hip flexion, really, really far. So that way, little by little, we can begin to creep ourselves into the extension phase, and then finally into somewhat of the hyperextension phase. We're not quite there yet to the hyperextension phase. We got to master this first. So all she's going to do there is go ahead and take a break, drop the pelvis to the floor. We're keeping the TBA in, and so we're going to lift the hips, you're going to go anteriorly tilt, and then you're going to posteriorly shift the pelvis, which means the pelvis is just going to barely graze the floor. Now, if I put my hand underneath the swell of her back here, her lumbar spine is almost going to curve around that. Then she's going to draw in her TVA to kind of flatten the lumbar spine a bit more there. Give me a posterior pelvic tilt. Really drive a posterior pelvic tilt strong, Kathy. More. And then lift your hips. This is what most of you are going to do with your hamstrings as you push here. You're going to do a lumbar rounding, and you're going to create you're going to have a lumbar flexion. You're going to have a posterior pelvic tilt, and there's going to be a whole assortment of different issues that are going to go on with you here. So what she's going to then do is drop her pelvis and go into her anterior tilt to neutralize that. Now we're lengthening the glute fibers, lengthening the hamstring fibers. Go ahead and give me a little more anterior tilt, Kathy. Good. Start dropping the pelvis a little lower. Stop there. You're pushing against the wall, and then you're going to pull yourself up, but the hips do not move. Okay? As you begin to do that, you should be able to feel a great amount of contraction right there in that posterior chain. Go ahead and take a break. We're going to attack that one more time. Okay? Driving through the heels. Toes are underneath the knees, so we need to drop the feet a little bit lower. Lower. So really what we're just doing here is just replicating the same mechanics of a squat. We're just going into a squat position, but we're going to, most people when they do their squat, they emphasize their squat with their quadriceps. I'm emphasizing the activation through the hamstrings and the glutes. The reason that you want to have that is mainly because it just makes you better at moving three-dimensionally. Your glutes lead a lot of your movements, and they move in three planes of motion. Your quadriceps are a singular plane muscle, and we don't want to orient that if we're trying to move better in 3 dimensions, which is what we do here at Functional Patterns. So once again, I'm going to have Kathy lifting her pelvis. She's going to go into her anterior pelvic tilt, and then go a little bit posterior pelvic shift to the floor. Hold that. She's going to drive her heels into the wall, and then pull her heels up, but she's not going to move. So as she pulls up, the muscles that are going to impede her from lifting her pelvis too high are actually going to be her rectus abdominis muscles, and are going to be her transverse abdominis. That's going to stop it. Just drive against the wall a little bit, pull the heels down, anteriorly tilt the pelvis, and right there we should begin to get a good tension right here out of that upper glute, or lower glute, upper hamstring region. Okay, go ahead and take a break. So for those of you trying to look for better squat depth, what you can also do is even move closer to the wall. No, yeah, there we go. I see what you're doing. Okay, then scoot back a little further right there. So now we got a little more depth, and you can institute the exact same thing if you're trying to get more of that tension. She can even begin to move further away from the wall. Keep going, stop there. And she can begin to institute a little bit more of that pressure. So push off the wall, anteriorly tilt the pelvis, press off the wall. Good. And she can get similar contractions. We also want to make sure the knees don't spread out too much. We want the knees neutral. The knees stay neutral to the ASIS, anterior superior iliac spine. So that little bone on the front side of your pelvis, the knees always stay aligned with that. And we're always hip width apart. Just always think when we do most of our functions, we're thinking gait cycles. So right here, she's hip width apart. Now she can move back even further. Right there, she pushes off the wall slightly. Now it's going to require a little bit of posterior tilt rather than anterior tilt, but it's up to you guys to adjust that. If you can set up a mirror right here or be by a mirror to check out what you're doing, then to check that your spine's neutral, you can do it in this fashion if you want to. These are just options that you have available to you. You'll begin to get a lot of the calf activation going on here because that's what's flexing the knee joint proximally at that point. So the calves will pull this way or they'll pull this way to flex the knee a little bit. But these are other options that you can have for there. Okay, take a break. Now we're going to move on to moving this into a unilateral position. So now I'm going to have Kathy standing up. And we're going to employ this in maybe the most important position that you can apply as a human being. It's this unilateral position where you're operating this way. Our bodies over millions and millions of years have learned to adapt this. This is a transition from moving and swinging on branches and from vines like this to essentially walking in this fashion. This is a transition. This is an evolutionary adaptation that human beings have made. Doing this bilaterally is important, just for the sake of building a connection, because I know you guys will build a connection in a bilateral stance, which means your feet are side by side, but really what we want to build it on is this unilateral position. This position right here is one of the most important that you can master, and and if you don't get it mastered, again, you're going to get stuck with your movement, because when you think about all the dynamic movements that we do in reality, it all stems from this. Most of the time, if I'm moving laterally, if I'm going to sprint, if I'm going to box, if I'm going to throw a ball, I'm working from unilateral positions all the time when I do mostly anything with my body. So we have to consider that anytime I'm functioning in real life, or most of the time when I'm functioning in real life, my positioning needs to be like this. Okay? So with that said, we're going to institute a very important type of muscle activation, which is going to incorporate the hamstrings and the glute max and the hip flexors on the opposite side. So I'm going to have Kathy standing right here into her unilateral stance. Now, although this seems like a very easy stance to get into, most of you guys are going to do this. Bring your ball of your foot down, and then drop your heel. Okay, most of you are going to do that when you're on the unilateral position. That's because you're just used to, especially if you train, you're always used to just having both feet flat on the ground. You've never approached this reality. So most, when you tell them to go unilateral, will just go ahead and drop their heel down like that. That's going to create an asymmetrical weight shift in the hips. A whole assortment of problems are going to pop up from standing that way. So what I'm going to have you guys do is move your foot back a little bit further, Kathy. A little bit further, right there. I'm going to have you thinking about working in a box. The box is going to be your ASIS. Here, let me actually stand over here so I can show you guys. This is going to be my box. These lines right here, this whole diagram, you guys have probably seen these in my videos on YouTube. These diagrams right here just represent the width of your ASIS. This determines the size of your box. This diagram right here is probably a little too big for me, but it's still going to be okay, because my ASIS is about right here, and the diagram shows that it's a little bit broader than that. So when you think about setting up your unilateral stance, your box will be created by your pelvis. This will be the base position. Can you go longer? Absolutely, you can go longer. But again, we're not working on that right now. Right now, we're working on base positioning. This is the whole point, the foundations of it all, of where you need to activate from. So we're going to operate on this box. One part of the ball of your foot's going to be on this part of the line, and then the other one's going to be primarily your heel. You're going to go here. So then eventually it's going to open up the doorway to moving in the transverse plane. So you have your ball of your foot primarily here, forefoot over here, and this is your unilateral position. This is the benchmark. I just kind of gave you guys this visual right now to make sure that you guys can wire that in, that you understand what you're doing specifically here. So just think of a little box. So as I have Kathy operating over here, she already understands this stuff intrinsically. Okay? So right here I'm going to have Kathy bending her right knee a slight bit. Let's get on that lateral view again. This is what you guys are going to do. Go ahead and put your heel down about 3/4 of the way. This is what most of you will do whenever you go unilateral position. The heel's going to drop on the back side. The knee joint is going to move forward on the front side. This is how most people operate unilaterally. It's very dysfunctional. It's fundamentally why people who do lunges end up doing a big long lunge and their knees rise forward. Main reason for that is because they don't have posterior chain support and they don't have hip flexor support on the opposite side. Okay? So if I tell Kathy, go ahead and move that right knee forward. If I just tell Kathy to fight my hand here with her knee, that's going to move back. If I tell Kathy to fight my hand here with her hip flexor, it's going to move forward. And that's where I want you guys operating from. The knees are pretty much going to be parallel to one another. Let's come get an anterior view over here. So the knees are going to be right next to each other. So if this is back, bring it back, and this is forward, we have a problem. These need to come together. If you're an athlete trying to develop very, very proficient footwork, if your knees are in the opposite of where you're at here, you are going to have problems. You are going to blow out your ACL. You are going to have twisted ankles. You're going to have ankle injuries, plantar fascia problems, lumbar spine problems. This is what keeps your center of gravity off. bring your left knee forward. When you operate under this spectrum right here, it's going to open up a whole new gateway of movement that's going to make your footwork much more choppy and precise. And if you're like a wide receiver or even a baseball player, anybody looking for acceleration, this will be something that you need to learn. So the back heel comes off the ground, okay, which means that's going to move the knee forward, and then the front knee is going to move backwards until these 2 points are pretty much parallel. That's what we're going to work on here. Now you're going to prioritize almost completely. You guys can train this, but for right now, I think I'm going to have you guys prioritizing for about 75-80% on your lead foot and about maybe 20%-ish somewhere around there on your back foot. And all I'm going to have you guys do while you're in this, you're going to drag the floor backward without moving anything on your body. Some of you will have the inkling that as soon as I tell you to drag the floor backward, you're going to start dropping your chest and doing this. Don't do that. It's a functional position if you want to pick something up, but you don't operate here. You need to be able to operate with that positioning completely vertical and hinged. You need to be able to do them all as far as I'm concerned. So as you guys see me drop down and up, I'm able to maintain verticality from bottom to the top. So I'm not doing this. This is what I used to teach before. It's not that it was wrong, it was just very limited in terms of the context that we're looking at. So I'm going to have her dragging her heel on her right side, but she's not going to fall back into this hip hinge. She's going to maintain neutrality, staying vertical. As she drives her right heel back, she's then going to push on the ground forward with the right foot. That's going to create some hip flexor activation over here. When I'm running, we have to consider that if this is in hip flex or hip extension, and this is in hip flexion, or if this is in hip hyperextension, this is in hip flexion. When I pull back here, there has to be a reciprocated tension that comes from the hip flexors on this side. It's inescapable. We have to have this. So if we're going to build the foundational tensions in the body, we have to think that this is going to push forward as this pulls back. So if we activate this to the brain, it already understands, and through the fascial connections, the fascial fabric, the body already understands that if this comes forward, this is going to come back, and then you will begin to get that glute max activation. So all you're going to do, if this is her right leg where she's at, this is going to pull back. It's not going to slide. You're just going to institute ground force coming this way, right? Her left foot is going to be doing, this is her right foot, her left foot's going to be doing this. So it's essentially like you're pinching the ground right here. So as this pulls back and this comes forward, we're pinching the ground. The left one is going to load the hip flexors, the rectus femoris, the psoas. The right one is going to load the hamstrings and the glute max on extension. So this is loading hip flexion on the left side. This is loading hip extension on the right side from that flex position. So we just think about orienting that tension, and this is going to be where we start. Your whole goal here, where you should primarily feel your tension, should be in the right glute max. The left hip flexors may not be felt too much when you do this, but you really should begin to feel your glute max. So all I'm going to have Kathy doing from here is retracting the abdomen, bending her knees a little bit more, stop there. Then I'm going to have her drag her heel back on her right side. Okay, there's another very, very common problem that people have, and Kathy specifically had this problem while she'd do this exercise. It's still a structural issue. It's called the knee valgus. It's where the knee begins to cave inward, right? So I want you to do that with your right knee, Kathy. Okay, so most of you are going to do this, where you rotate your knee inward. You have to be very watchful that your knee does not rotate inward while you're in this unilateral stance. What I want you guys to focus on, there's going to be two things I want you to do. You're going to bend the knee a little bit more, stop there. Then you're going to rotate the knee out and then drag your heel back. So rotate the knee out, drag the heel back. It just means that your lateral gluteal fascia, the lateral quadricep fascia, and the lateral hamstrings are just almost completely inactive because your knee has dropped inward into that valgus. So what I want her to do, she's going to rotate her knee out, then drag her heel back. Beautiful. Keep the knee bent. Now, if you drag the heel back, it doesn't mean that you extend the knee. When you drag the heel back, it doesn't mean that you move anything. You just drag the heel back and nothing moves on the body. You're just instituting tension on the hamstring. That's all you got to think about. So if the knee caves in, you rotate it out, then pull back. If your knee goes out, all you do is just rotate the knee in and then drag back. If you make those adjustments, it's going to correct so many facets of your functional movement when you're performing anything. But anything in regards like running, kettlebell work, and pretty much this is a one-stop shop to fix a lot of your deficiencies if you can cue this correctly. And those are the biggest things that I need you to look at. Also, we got to just look for the pelvis being square, the shoulders being completely aligned, the pelvis is completely aligned, rib cage is completely aligned from left to right. If she begins to shift her pelvis that way, as many of you will, that's typically when you actually see that knee begin to cave in. So as your pelvis moves that way, go ahead and cave that right knee in, Kathy, internally rotate. That's typically what you're going to see. So it's going to be up to you to shift your pelvis this way, hold the pelvis neutral, and then begin to institute your heel drag while these are all in neutral points. You just get in the mirror, look at it, keep most of your weight on your front foot, right? You can even begin to practice on getting your weight completely off of your back foot. Bend the knee and get a little bit of pressure there, Kathy. You're going to have to tilt over a little bit in order for you to facilitate that action to happen. You can't stay completely perfectly upright. You're going to have to tilt off and lean to the side when you do that, which is completely fine. That's a very, very important aspect of movement, is the leaning. It's very important when it comes to movement. So as she's here, these are all the variables that we're looking for. The ankle is going to stack under the knee under the hip, shoulders. We've covered this before in the standing neutral. All you're doing is applying these same principles into a dynamic context. Okay? So now have her switching sides. Left heel is going to come forward. About 20% of the pressure to her back foot. She can put some pressure there. She's going to push her back foot forward, drag her left heel back. Abdominals are going to remain in. Nothing moves, guys. Really pay close attention to that. If I tell you to drag the heel back and push the foot forward, it means that nothing moves. It doesn't mean that the knees extend. It doesn't mean that you do hip flexion. It doesn't mean that you do pelvic rotation. When you drag back, it doesn't mean that you rotate your knees in. It means that the knees stay in the sagittal plane. If you're looking at the kneecap here, that stays in place. The hips stay in place from a lateral view and an anterior view. They don't really rotate your pelvis to your left a little bit, Kathy. Right there, hold that. Abdominals are in. So the hips stay completely stable. They don't move. The rib cage stays where it's at. Of course, this is not a complete depiction of what's happening mechanically with the body. There's things that are way more advanced than this. However, if you understand this positioning right now, it's going to cover about 80% of the problems going on with your body, because the issue that people have is not the fact that they can't move into extreme positions. I've seen plenty of yogis that can do that, and I've seen plenty of Olympic lifters that can lift a house if they wanted to. But the fundamental problem is, go ahead and take a break, Kathy. The fundamental problem here is that people don't understand the center. They're either on one end of the spectrum or they're the opposite end of the spectrum. They don't understand the central spectrums of what's going to make a person function better in this reality. And that's really what I want you guys to focus on, is that this entire Human Foundations is just understanding the center. We're not pushing the extremes too much. There's certain things that we did on the wall that was kind of pushing the extremes that you can play around with. I've given you guys ideas of what you can do, but some of that stuff is going to be way later on down the road. We're looking at about a good 4 months down the road before you can start pushing those other spectrums. So for right now, all I'm concerned with you guys is that you guys just find this neutral point in that unilateral stance. Go ahead and get there, Kathy. Pull the abdominals in. And when it comes to gait, I'm going to show you your gait cycle. I'm going to show you guys how you're going to begin to apply this. Rotate your torso towards me, Kathy. Hold that. We'll eventually start working into how we begin to employ this within our unilateral stance. We're also going to do exercises that are going to work the slings in this context, and it's going to change your movement dramatically. So there's a fefew cues. Actually, we'll give them one more lateral view before we're done here. Move that right foot forward, Kathy. That's the most important one for them to see. Another aspect of the joint stacking I want you guys to see is that the knee joint does not cross the ankle too far. Go ahead. So we're not doing that. That's a big one. That's usually a big mistake that people make. Remember, that knee comes back until the tibia is completely vertical. So this should be completely vertical. And I think at that point we've covered most of what we need to cover before I can send you guys off into the next week. So that was week 7. Practice this, wire it in, make sure you associate that activation with the TVA, the activation with the thoracic spine, and unify that activation with the gluteus maximus. So we're activating all 3 pillars of posture that you probably read in my Power of Posture, but we're now starting to activate them in a more dynamic context. You're starting to feel those muscle sensations pop up in places that are going to, in positions that you're going to highly relate to when you approach the functional environment. Anyway, I'll see you guys very soon. Tune in for the following week and we'll get that sucker going. Take care.